Hello, this is Wade Frazier. This is we got here 11:57 a.m. on February 13th, 2026. Valentine's Day is tomorrow. Um, I just lost an hour and 15 minutes of the video I was making because Microsoft software is so unstable, which I got forced onto here this last year. Uh, Zoom crashes, Microsoft crashes. It's life in high tech. Um, so this is going to continue the oral history that I've been doing. Um, this is, I think, the 16th post. Um, and as I noted in the previous video of the series, once Dennis Lee walked out of jail, um, I knew he'd be okay. He's the most resourceful person I ever met, so I knew that he'd be all right. I have one more anecdote relating to his release gives a little color on the situation. When Dennis returned to jail from the bail hearing that reduced his bail from $750,000 to zero, Dennis announced it to his inmates, and again that he would be released the next day. And his inmates then hoisted him on his shoulders and carried him around their cell block cheering as the stupefied guards watched. And as I noted before, Dennis. So when Dennis got out, he lived with Wayne, because Wayne already took in Dennis's wife and children. So Dennis lived there for several months after he got out of jail, and it was his only phone number for years, was Wayne's phone number. And Wayne told me one day that he would still, years after that, he would get phone calls from Dennis's inmates, former inmates, calling to thank the man who turned their lives around and to let him know they were doing okay. Yeah, so like Allison, Dennis's wife, said that Dennis grows where he is planted. So he saw his time in jail as an opportunity to minister to his inmates. That's Dennis. When Dennis was released, the judge had some conditions, and one of them is that Dennis had to sign into the jail every day. And Wayne lived 10 minutes from the jail, so that was easily done. And the other was that he needed the judge's permission to leave Ventura. And so he had to do that. I previously discussed that Dennis, because of his migrant farm worker background, his literalist Christianity, his nationalistic stuff, etc., he attracted a lot of constitutionalists. And again, the constitutionalists helped me file my lawsuit against them for my civil rights violations after the raid. And when Dennis was in jail, he had heard again. He was in that milieu of these constitutionalists, and he repeatedly heard of the best constitutionalist attorney in the country, a guy named Bill. And Bill, I've seen interviews with Bill since then. Over the years, I've seen interviews with him, and he became a constitutionalist attorney not because he believed in the cause of limited government, but he got into it because he saw it as an unexploited niche in the legal profession, so he can make a living doing it, defending constitutionalists, tax protesters, this kind of thing. So yeah, Bill was in it for the money. Nice guy, but in it for the money. And especially became suing governments for violating his clients' rights, especially for police brutality. And the last I looked, a few years ago, I looked into it. Last I saw, he lived in a $5 million mansion, courtesy of those lawsuits. Again, I've called him Mr. Big Time Attorney in my writings, but I'm going to call him Bill. That's his name. And again, all the identities in all this are easily discovered if people just get Dennis's books. That's probably the easiest way to find out who they are. People want to know people's identities. Almost all of them can be found that way. Bill had just moved to California from Colorado when Dennis got out of jail. And then Dennis got a permission from the judge to go visit Bill in San Diego. And yeah, Dennis' case was high profile among constitutionalists, and Bill knew of Dennis. And so, and then the year that Dennis was arrested, one of Bill's cases went to the United States Supreme Court. So Bill was defending tax protesters against the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS. And so, in fact, Bill, he got IRS personnel convicted of felony crimes in their pursuit of his clients. And the crime I remember the most was that they encouraged people to steal documents for them from their prosecutorial targets. And you're supposed to have, a search warrant, this kind of stuff, but they encouraged people to steal documents for them. That was a crime. And I don't know, I think there were other crimes, but that was the one I remember the best because it also happened in Dennis's case. So in Dennis's case, the sheriff's deputies, again, people said, I want to steal some stuff from Dennis's company. Do you want me to? And they're like, well, we can't order you to, but okay, well, it's on your own initiative. So a couple days later, the woman calls up the deputies with the stolen documents and say, hey, you want them? And so it was in their investigative report. In fact, Bill was regularly astounded by the unprofessionalism and idiocy of the Ventura County officials who actually put that in an investigative report where they should have said theft's a crime. That's what they should have said. Anyway, so Bill went down to San Diego and he had a mountain of documentation he presented to Bill on his case, and Bill went through the case, and again, these kind of instances came up, and anyway, so Bill basically goes, oh, Dennis, you don't have a case against you, and I'm going to sue him for violating your rights. That's what I do. So anyway, so Bill was like, his mouth was watering. He saw a big payday coming from suing Ventura County officials. And, Dennis, he earlier asked Melvin Belli to represent him, and Belli wanted $250,000 up front. But Bill was just going, Dennis, can you pay me something? And Dennis said, well, I got $10,000 I can pay you, which was the last of my legal fund. So anyway, so Bill got paid $10,000, he came aboard. And because he just moved from Colorado, he didn't have his license to practice in California yet. And he came to Ventura. In fact, the night before his hearing, as I recall, is when he and his assistant met with me for dinner, and they interviewed me for a few hours. And Wayne and I were really the only real supporters of Dennis at that time. And Bill went to the hearing the next day and announced himself as Dennis's new attorney. But a couple things. So Bill said, I have all these. I'm busy. I have a bunch of lawsuits going on, trials, etc. And this was almost all the federal court level. And he said that his plate was full, so he wouldn't really to represent Dennis for a few months. And he also informed the judge that he was getting his California license in the process of it, so he didn't have it yet, so he really couldn't represent Dennis on the case. And so the judge took the opportunity to try to dismiss Bill from the case. Well, since you can't do it. Well, Bill replied, and this was Bill. So Bill said, Your Honor, the Constitution guarantees that my client would have the attorney of his choice, who is me. So I can't be dismissed for your reasoning. And so the judge backed down. Like, okay. But after the hearing was over, Mr. Prosecutor and friends contacted the state bar and said that Bill was practicing without a license in California, which is a blatant lie. Okay, and it actually held up Bill's license in California for months because of that. And it was the first of the many gutter maneuvers that Ventura County did, Bill was shocked by their backwoods, unprofessional, disgusting behavior. Yeah, he was used to the more gentlemanly atmosphere in the federal courts, and the backwoods tactics that Ventura County used. It was really shocking. And when they held up his license, he started taking it personally. Yeah, he didn't get off on the right foot with those people. And again, this prosecutor, she was a rube from the One Building Law School down the street, totally overmatched by Bill. In fact, Dennis said for the rest of the case, it was really the judge versus Bill. The prosecutor was just along for the ride taking orders. And not long after hiring Bill, Dennis was invited to speak at a new science conference in Colorado. Like, it was a spinoff organization from one that I joined the next year, these new science organizations. And Anyway, so Dennis got permission from the judge to go. So he flew there to Colorado to speak. And maybe there's 1,000 people there or something. And anyway, so when Dennis shows up, Bill Delp, the hitman from Seattle, showed up to Dennis's appearance. And the way those kind of conferences work is that there's a general gathering of 1,000 people, or whatever, and then there would be like side meetings of 200 people or whatever for various people who had spoken to the General Assembly to then have more focused kind of discussions. During the General Assembly, Bill really wasn't in a position to do much, but at the breakoff meeting, he got up and started yelling at Dennis and lied. Again, Bill's a murderer, so Bill lied, etc., and heckling Dennis. And Dennis gave it back, and Bill was escorted from the room. In fact, it was almost became violent. And then actually, Bill sort of worked the crowd there at that meeting, and anybody who would express interest in Dennis, he would corner them, even take them to dinner and stuff, and then he just lied to them about Dennis. And so, just like he did in Seattle. So in Seattle, he claimed that he was owed 5,000 vacation pay when he worked at Dennis's company for 6 whole weeks. And the 5,000 was just because the federal bankruptcy court, that was a de minimis amount, so he had to make up $5,000 to even get the lawsuit on. So again, it's just like he just makes stuff up as he went. And so then at this new science conference, he said that he was one of Dennis's investors who Dennis never delivered on. He just make it up. And anyway, let's just say he just successfully dissuaded anybody at that conference from having anything to do with Dennis afterward. And this is Bill. So anyway, so Bill, I believe that he probably got a bonus. In fact, this was the first indication that I had that he was really working for the global elites, not just the local electric companies. And in fact, the next year, I joined the parent organization of that spinoff in Colorado. I actually joined the organization. And the year after that, I actually helped them at their national conference because it was hosted right there where I lived in Ohio. And I actually had the members list of the day because we were checking people in and stuff. And while I was there, I looked to see if Bill's name was there, and it was. So Bill had joined all these new science organizations, keeping his ear to the ground for his masters. And so, yeah, Bill was a psychopath and working on behalf of the global elite. And he probably got a bonus for his performance at Dennis's talk. And that was probably his last bonus because he soon moved to Florida and lived a life of crime in Florida, ripping his customers off and then suing them if they complained. Yeah, the guy's a criminal. And again, but he died last year, so I can name him now. And so, yeah, Bill probably had a grim afterlife at this point. And so I realized, and this was one of my early indicators, that these new science organizations, these fringe organizations and stuff, they're full of people like Bill. The agents of the CIA, agents of the global elite, et cetera, are at these conferences making sure they're doing intelligence work, making sure that none of these threats ever get to where they become, they have to deal with all the threats. And so Bill's performance at Dennis's talk was one of those of trying to make sure that the threat would not become a threat, right? So yeah, that's how it works. In fact, and then because so many people just bought his lies, is again their naivete is also one of the, again I learned so much about this already, but it was another indicator for me how the free energy field is in a state of arrested development. Yeah, so almost nobody in the field today has the right stuff, which is why I really don't want anything to do with the field today because it's all a bunch of naive people or criminals or con men or messiahs, the three-ring circus, and none of it's productive that I've seen. Anyway, once Bill took the case, I saw him pretty regularly. So he came, I saw him, I don't know, I saw Bill 7, 8 times probably, some number like that. And during one of Bill's visits, he told me, I hear these pithy sayings from Bill, and one day I was talking to him, and he goes, if you're seeking the truth, don't go looking for it in a courtroom. Yeah, so he realized the courtroom is just about winning and losing. The truth, justice, none of that has anything to do with what happens in courtrooms in the United States. Yeah, justice is, it's irrelevant. Justice, truth. They don't care. Yeah, of course, and there's perverse incentives everywhere. I said even Bill was in it for the money, right? So, but the further Bill got into Dennis's case, the more amazed he was that Ventura County didn't even have a case. Yeah, it was like some file he didn't, some form he didn't file. And in fact, Bill contacted the attorney who wrote the law that they got Dennis on, and he estimated that there were 100,000 businesses like Dennis's that probably should have filed the form. And Dennis was the only one singled out of 100,000 people for not filing the form. That's how justice works in California. And so again, he was, Bill thought, he was going to beat whatever charges that were against Dennis, that would be beatable. But Bill was really interested in suing the officials for all their crimes they committed during the prosecution of Dennis. Another time I talked with Bill and again, discussing the theft of Mr. Researcher's office during the raid. And when, the deputies, they said that was the last place they searched, et cetera, and Bill kind of laughed at that, how these rubes, is such a, he said, oh yeah, the scene of the crime, avoid that at all costs to the very end. And innocently looked like there was nothing there. It was he was laughing at their, stupid attempts at covering up their crime. So it was, really, these guys were lightweights. And Bill's like, Bill had seen real criminals. These guys were, they were backwoods guys. And they just, depended on nobody being able to stand up to them. That's really what was going on. And again, also on behalf of the global elite, certainly to some degree. And I'll never know how deep that all went. At one of the hearings, so after he'd been on the case for a few months, Bill mentioned the many acts of prosecutorial misconduct that the deputies and others had committed. And the judge actually seemed surprised. And he asked Bill what he was referring to. And Bill actually, he had a list. Bill was ready. So he ran down a list of the crimes that he alleged that the deputies and prosecutors had committed during the prosecution of Dennis. And the judge apparently was impressed enough, and he called for a prosecutorial misconduct hearing. So the worm had turned. So misconduct hearings are very rare. I don't know if they ever had one in Ventura County before then, but they're definitely a rare event. And so now the prosecution's on trial. So the worm had turned in Ventura. And it turned out that Bill's case that went to the United States Supreme Court was actually relevant to Dennis's case. And this is in 1988 when this case was decided by the Supreme Court. In fact, it was William Rehnquist ran that court, which was, that court was legendary for its corruption. The Rehnquist court actually justified what they today call extraordinary rendition, which is the United States to go in foreign countries and kidnap people and bring them back to the United States, throw them in prison, throw away the key kind of thing. And so, in fact, even put them in get mode where they have no rights. It's just gangster stuff. And the Rehnquist court justified that. And I've seen it with alternative practitioners in medicine. They kidnapped from Mexico and South America because they're curing people of cancer, curing Americans who have to leave the country. And so you kidnap their doctor in foreign countries. That's how the FDA and the medical racket operates. So the Rehnquist court has all said, that's cool. Yeah, we can kidnap. Who cares about the sovereignty of other nations? We're the United States, so we can do whatever we want. So in the case that was ruled in the Rehnquist court, Bill's case, again, the IRS had actually committed felony acts in pursuit of Bill's client. And so Bill's argument was, well, the state's the case should be thrown out because of the misconduct, criminal. So again, I think some IRS guys went to prison over that. And so he said the state's case is tainted. You can't separate out. The evidence is all tainted. So it's like the whole case. You got admitted criminals doing the prosecuting. So it's all prejudiced and it's all corrupted. And so the case should be dismissed. Well, the Supreme Court said, nope. Even though, yes, criminals are doing the prosecuting and they even went to prison, we'll just put new prosecutors in and keep going. And the state's case is fine. That was the Rehnquist court. Well, actually, Thurgood Marshall, who was the first black Supreme Court justice, he dissented. And you can see, and basically, I mean, common sense, right? It's like if the criminals doing the prosecuting and they get caught and they go to prison, you just can't replace them with new prosecutors and keep going. The case should be dismissed. Well, anyway, so Bill's client still had to face the charges, and he was acquitted. And Bill had won something like 100 cases in a row before he took Dennis's case. And then again, after Dennis got arrested, in fact, the night, so I literally went over to Wayne's house the night Dennis got released. And there were already people there from the company who had been in hiding, who had disappeared because, yeah, everybody was terrified of Mr. Deputy and playing King Rat and all that kind of stuff. But once Dennis got out of jail, a lot of people realized the coast was clear. And so a lot of people came forward about the threats that Mr. Deputy had made and all the criminal behavior, et cetera. So, yeah, Mr. Deputy's career case began crumbling when Dennis got out of jail, and then it only accelerated with the misconduct hearing. And the most important testimony was Mr. Researcher's. So he came out of hiding. So Mr. Deputy threatened him into hiding when Dennis was in jail, and he came out of hiding soon before Dennis was released from jail. So he was in hiding for 2-3 months, something like that. And he testified. And he testified to Washington deputies ransack his office and photograph the blueprints and all this kind of stuff before the search officially began. And he also told of Mr. Deputy threatening him in interrogation and stuff, the tape the deputies lost, all this kind of stuff. And he had impeccable international credentials and defended the technology, the heat pump, heat engine. Yeah, he was like, he was a big gun in the courtroom. In fact, the biggest gun they'd ever had in that courtroom, probably. And impeccable credentials. And Dennis said to the judge, when Mr. Prosecutor testified, the judge was in rapt attention. In fact, the judge's face turned like purple. He was, and probably from anger of what Mr. Researcher had been through by the by the deputies, et cetera. So yeah, he turned beet red. And in fact, Dennis said that Mr. Research's testimony turned the tide on the case. In fact, when he got off the case, then it was me. So I followed him on the witness stand. And my testimony was not as spectacular, but it was largely confined to the lies Mr. Deputy told me when I could have copies of the documents. In fact, I don't think it ever, and I don't know why, but like when he was making faces at me and stuff when I was a witness stand, that didn't come up. And it's like, and I don't, there's probably some legal reason why that was, but that changed my life when he did that. So, but somehow that wasn't part of the misconduct charges or whatever, which should be. That should have been. And Miss Prosecutor, yeah, she wasn't having any fun with the misconduct hearing. In fact, when I was on the witness stand, she looked mortified the entire time. Just kind of had her head down, and yeah, it was bad for it. She was getting drugged through her own mud. And in fact, she only asked me one question, which was inconsequential. But there was a humorous event when I testified, which is that Wayne, the professor, his wife, attended my testimony. And she came in during my testimony, sat in the back of the courtroom there. Well, again, the courtroom was practically empty. There was probably only a few people in the public seats. But anyway, she got in, and when she sat down quietly in the back, yeah, when the door opened, Miss Prosecutor turned around and saw her come in, and she sat down, and Mr. Prosecutor stopped the proceedings, kind of shrieking to the judge that somebody was in the room watching the testimony. And she said she might be a witness or something, so I demand that she be identified before this hearing goes any further. And the judge almost laughingly dismissed her claims. Yeah, they didn't want anybody watching what was going on because it was a little embarrassing for the Ventura County officials. And Mr. Cub Reporter, the one who was laughing and joking with Mr. Deputy during my testimony at the preliminary hearing, he was nowhere to be seen. In fact, Bill subpoenaed the Cub Reporter for his role in smearing Dennis with his articles and his close relationship to Mr. Deputy. And right after he got subpoenaed, Mr. Cub Reporter wrote the only accurate article that I ever saw him write about Dennis's case. And so he knew how to write accurate articles, but it wasn't his job. He was a propagandist for the Ventura County power structure and unwittingly for global elites. So that was interesting how a subpoena could all of a sudden get him to report accurately. Imagine that. And Mr. Deputy, so yeah, his whole career-making case was crumbling before his eyes. And so he was no longer King Rat. And so he was called upon to testify. But he all of a sudden became ill and was in his and bedridden for several months and couldn't testify. And so, and Mr. Bill, he was scoffed in open court about it. In fact, Bill, he didn't just accept that. So he demanded that he get a medical examination. And again, he got the results. In fact, in open court, his only response was, "Well, it wasn't AIDS." So yeah, that was so. Mr. Deputy was not having fun hiding at home. Yeah, and so yeah, and quite a few people testified who he threatened, and so, but anyway, eventually he did. But when I testified at the misconduct hearing, there was a journalist there from a newspaper in Kern County, next county over, where Bakersfield is. And I described Bakersfield before as where the redneck side of my family lived there, lives there, lives there still. And but Kern County is probably as corrupt as Ventura County. And that journalist, he was talking about a case that his newspaper was like advocating, et cetera, where a couple of cops there, I don't know if they're sheriff's deputies or policemen in Bakersfield, who got high on cocaine and were driving their car like 100 miles an hour through town, ran a red light and hit a car. And the woman in the car, I mean, it hit her and almost killed her, and it killed the deputy, so they were the policeman. So whoever those two men died, again, high on cocaine. But the woman was arrested and prosecuted for reckless driving or something. And then, anyway, and so there's the cocaine or so was being covered up. So anyway, these guys were investigative reporters, and so they, yeah, Dennis's case was a big deal to them, and so they came a long way to come and cover the case, and they did. They wrote a bunch of articles about Dennis's case. And when Dennis's case got remanded to Superior Court, after the Kangaroo Court preliminary hearing, a man I will call Mr. Investigator became Miss Prosecutor's assistant. So, like, when I testified and Mr. Deputy sat in front of me, well, now it was Mr. Investigator sitting in front of me when I did the misconduct testimony. And his participation in the case became revelatory. And I mentioned Stan, the engineer, Mr. Engineer, who, again, ended up signing off the guys who stole the company of Ventura until they got to Texas and they winkled those stickers away from them, the UOL stickers. And then they fired him, and he ended up getting back home to his home in Ellensburg, Washington, penniless. And Stan disappeared. Yeah, during the preliminary, he disappeared and stuff. And then during the misconduct hearing, Mr. Investigator actually went 1,000 miles to Yakima to go to Ellensburg to go see Stan, and he went to Stan's house. And in earlier videos, I've talked about where when Dennis's company was stolen in Seattle, just before it happened, I helped take Bob Vandermoss, the inventor. I helped take his equipment from Dennis's facility and then put it in Stan's barn. We rented a big truck to do that. And his hot box, so the hot box he had, et cetera, was all part of that. So we put it in Stan's barn. Well, 4 years later, it was still sitting there. In fact, Bob probably died and never retrieved his stuff, because Dennis was Bob's only chance to make something happen, which was attacking Dennis was particularly stupid for Bob when he did that. But yeah, so Dennis was Bob's only hope to ever do anything in the inventing world. Anyway, so Mr. Investigator shows up to Stan's house, and he starts asking all these leading questions, etc. It's all dirty. And anyway, but then he said, "Is it true, Stan, that the hot box that Dennis promoted really didn't exist? It was imaginary?" And Stan said, "Well, Mr. Investigator, 50 yards from where we're standing, I can, in my barn right there, I can show you these hot boxes. So walk with me over to the barn. I'll show you these hot boxes that you think don't exist." And so Mr. Investigator, who traveled 1,000 miles to visit Stan, was unwilling to walk 50 yards to see the hot boxes for himself. And that kind of summarized the fidelity to the truth that Ventura County had. Yeah, that was an ironic moment. And so, to back up a little bit, so Mr. Researcher, when he came out of hiding, and then again, about the time the misconduct hearing started, Dennis served a subpoena on Mr. Researcher. Actually, it was an unfiled one, so it was kind of a fake subpoena. They hadn't filed with the because you have to file it with the court. He hadn't done that. He just wanted to meet with Mr. Researcher, and so, but Mr. Researcher got this, and he went to the courthouse to see if it was valid. And word got out that he was there. Ms. Prosecutor, Mr. Investigator came rushing out of their back offices and grabbed Mr. Researcher and took him back into their office to interrogate him. And it was an interrogation room with Mr. Researcher and then Mr. Investigator. And it was a much friendlier visit than with Mr. Deputy, when he was threatening, tears earlier when he was threatening Mr. Researcher. And so, in fact, Mr. Researcher, he sort of criticized Victor Fisher, and Victor Fisher disappeared. But he didn't, how to say it, Mr. Researcher, he always defended the technology, but he just was, again, he wasn't happy to be there. He wanted to just be, he didn't want to have anything to do with any of what was going on. He just wanted to be left alone, which I get. And so, but yeah, he had some responsibility in the whole thing. And so, anyway, at one point he actually said, he criticized Victor Fisher. And I listened to the tape of this interrogation, and Miss Prosecutor called Fisher Fishy Fisher. It's like a gossipy housewife, which is what she had been. Yeah, so that was her level of professionalism, was calling him Fishy Fisher. And then during a break in the, but the good stuff now comes. So during a break in the interrogation, Ms. Prosecutor had to leave for some reason, and so it was just Mr. Researcher and Mr. Investigator alone in the room. And Mr. Researcher asked Mr. Investigator, he said, "Have you ever thought that maybe Dennis is innocent?" And Mr. Investigator made this memorable reply: "I don't care if he's innocent. I'm paid to get convictions." Yes. And then Mr. Researcher then observed that the prosecution case seemed to be built on lies and half-truths, like this stack of BS that would easily fall over if it was poked just a little bit. And Mr. Investigator replied with, "Yeah, sure, we lie. Everybody lies. And I will lie however much I need to secure a conviction." Yeah, so probably most prosecutors think that, but only Ventura County could you hear him saying it aloud. And actually, to his credit, so in the years after that, for quite a number of years after that, Mr. Researcher would be called into jury duty. And when he'd be called into jury duty, he would repeat that conversation with Mr. Investigator to the judge, who'd immediately dismiss him from jury duty. So, yeah. And the year 1990 is when that conversation took place. And in that same year that Mr. Investigator made those comments, he was the first president of the Southern California Fraud Investigators Association. I could not make that up if I tried. And so, yeah, it's surreal. Dennis, again, I told you when Dennis got out of jail, I met with him the day he got out, but about a week later, 2 days later, he met with me and Wayne. Dennis was talking about how he's going to rebuild all this kind of stuff. And I told Dennis I was done. I said, "Dennis, I'm sorry, I'm done, man. I'm not interested in trying to rebuild the business." And so, but I didn't tell him I was his mysterious benefactor. I still didn't want anybody to know that. And anyway, apparently, a couple months later, I guess. So Wayne had told Dennis that it was some mysterious benefactor. Again, that mysterious benefactor turned the tide. But Dennis, again, Bill needed more money, et cetera. And so Dennis was like looking for more money. And he asked Wayne, he said, "Wayne, I need more money. Can this benefactor come through?" And then Wayne told him it was me. And so Dennis wrote in his book how proud and angry he was to learn that. That it had to be me. So angry probably because it was me. Everybody else chickened out and head for the hills. And yeah, Wayne and I, Wayne's wife, a couple of people, that was it. We were the only people standing up for Dennis when the night was the darkest. But anyway, during that, in fact, Mr. Investigator, I think, had more than one conversation with Mr. Researcher, I think, afterwards and stuff. And he was kind of gleeful that Mr. Deputy being ill. So Bill, the attorney, would have to drive up from San Diego 4 hours with the assistant, and then have a hearing to hear his postponed because of so-called ill health of Mr. Deputy. And so he'd have to drive back, a whole day blown to hear that. And so anyway, so Mr. Investigator was kind of gleefully asking Mr. Researcher where Dennis was getting his money from, because obviously these worthless days in the court were draining Dennis's legal fund. Yeah, he was looking forward to the day Dennis ran out of money, so it would just be a walkover for the prosecution. That's what he was counting on. He was eagerly counting on it, as he told Mr. Researcher. Yeah, this is hard to believe in ways, but this is how these people operated. So, and then about April 1990, I got married that month. And I actually attended one of the hearings in which Miss Prosecutor made a motion just to have Dennis re-jailed, put back in jail to have Mr. Deputies host him once again in jail. And because Dennis, and why? Because Dennis was trying to rebuild the business with Wayne. I guess that was a crime, at least in the prosecution's eyes. So yes, they were trying to get Dennis re-jailed because Wayne and he were trying to resurrect the business. In fact, they call it resurrection marketing, with Dennis's typical humor. And and then I'll go on later. I'll talk about this, but the whole ordeal bankrupted Wayne, ruined his life, shortened his life, and I'll discuss that another time. I've discussed this some before. But anyway, when the prosecutor tried to get Dennis re-jailed, the judge almost laughed when he dismissed her motion. But Bill saw red that day. And so a day or two later, Bill called Dennis up and he said, "Dennis, I prepared this lawsuit on my own. I didn't ask you to do it. I did it on my own initiative. And I'm going to file a lawsuit in federal court against the Ventura County officials. And these people are scum, and I have a duty to remove them from the law enforcement legal profession." Yeah. Bill was hot. Yeah, they had one too many times gone way over the line on what was really acceptable in the legal world. And so maybe not in Ventura County, but in the whole rest of the legal world, they were like chimpanzees practicing being lawyers and deputies, etc. So anyway, so he prepared this lawsuit and he asked Dennis, he said, "I'm going to file this lawsuit in federal court." In fact, here it is. It's 69 pages long. And anyway, he told Dennis to rally the press. So Bill basically, his plan was to file this lawsuit at the federal court in downtown LA, and then walk out onto the steps of the courthouse, and there would be a bunch of reporters standing there, and he would do a press conference. That was his plan. And Dennis immediately, how to say it, Dennis didn't have the experience of the media that Bill did. And so Dennis kind of expressed his skepticism that was actually going to happen. But Bill said, "They always come to my press conferences." So anyway, so Dennis actually got on the phone and he called LA's media, the newspapers, the TV stations, etc. And he got agreement. Everybody's like, "Yeah, it sounds newsworthy. We'll be there." So the next day, Bill files his lawsuit, walks out and Dennis came down with him. And so Bill files his lawsuit, walks out on the front steps, and there's nobody there, no press. And Bill was just like surprised. He was like really surprised, shocked that there was no press there. And so he and Dennis are sitting on the steps of the courthouse. And it turns out across the street there was a camera crew. There's a camera crew across the street. Anyway, so Bill, he gets up, adjusts his tie and walks across the street, and there was a woman reporter there with the camera crew. And he walks up to the reporter and he says, and anyway, that camera crew was covering their story for the news that night or whatever. It was the building had a crack in the foundation. So their story was about a crack in the foundation. And Bill walked up to this reporter and he said, "I don't know what you're covering, but it can't be nearly as important as what's going on across the street here, where I'm suing Ventura County's officials for their gross violation of my client's civil rights." And the reporter responded to Bill. She said, "Mr. Bill, Mr. Attorney Bill, I know who you are. I actually saw the invitation for your press conference on my editor's desk, and I actually asked if I could cover your press conference, and my editor wouldn't let me. So I only do stories that I'm allowed to, what they tell me to do. So I'm just an employee. So I was not authorized to cover your press conference. Dennis said at that moment, the light in Bill's eyes kind of went out. And Bill realized that he was up against something far bigger and more malevolent than the Internal Revenue Service. And I mean, his enthusiasm for Dennis's case quickly waned. Yeah, Bill was trying to make a name for himself in California and et cetera. He was planning to have a big media splash and a huge legal settlement and all this kind of stuff. And it quickly became evident that that probably wasn't going to happen. So Bill was like, and again, Bill was in it for the money and et cetera. And so, yeah, his enthusiasm for the case quickly waned. And Mr. Deputy did testify, though. He eventually testified, and Dennis gave him a good grade. Dennis said, Mr. Deputy, all of a sudden, all the threats he made, he remembered them as warnings, So telling a salesman he gets 60 years in prison for working for us, it wasn't a threat. Mr. Deputy said, it's just a warning, a friendly warning to the guy. Yeah. So anyway, he was good at that. But, when he did when Dennis had the arrested with $1 million bail, again, the bail schedule called for a $5,000 bail for Dennis's supposed crime. And Mr. Deputy, did an affidavit for $1 million bail with the judge rubber stamp. But in his affidavit, Mr. Deputy puffed up his credentials as this fraud expert. So I prosecuted so many hundreds of cases with fraud elements in them. I'm a fraud expert. So the court should rely on my fraud expertise to make sure that this man should have $1 million bail. Well, so at the misconduct hearing, Bill asked Mr. Deputy, he said, so you're such an expert in fraud. I have your affidavit here saying what an expert in fraud you are. So describe to me the legal elements of the crime known as fraud. And Mr. Deputy couldn't. He goes, I don't know that legal stuff, Mr. Expert. And so anyway, and Bill told me this. And so Bill, he said, can you name just one of the elements of the crime known as fraud? And Mr. Deputy was unable to. Yeah, in fact, he pulled a Ronald Reagan a lot during his testimony. He just forgets stuff. I don't remember any of this kind of stuff. I'm ill, whatever. So yeah, he was. Dennis gave him a B+, I think, in his testimony. So Stan, though, the engineer, he actually did come down from Washington after he got visited by Mr. Investigator. And he came down and testified for the prosecution. They still wanted him to testify. And Stan kind of hoodwinked him. So during the testimony, in fact, Stan told him, Dennis was lying about stuff. And so anyway, when he gets on the witness stand, they was like, so what did Dennis lie about? And he said, well, Dennis said it was free electricity. And well, it's not free because you have to buy the equipment. So yeah, he was actually saying maybe we could do free electricity. So did Mr. Researcher. So they had two heavyweight. These guys were heavyweight international level engineers who were testifying that this stuff could work. And again, Dennis had the best heating system in the world, this kind of stuff. And so, in fact, when Stan got done testifying, the judge, when I saw Dennis last year, he said the judge actually hit his gavel. I've heard enough. And he took everybody back in his chambers, and he basically said to Miss Prosecutor, he goes, there's no case for fraud here. And so, the fraud charges just went up in smoke, And so it was, again, it was all fabricated. They fabricated victims and everything else. So they had no case for fraud. And so, what was left after they dropped the fraud charges was Dennis didn't file a form and pay $50. Now the judge was not a paragon of virtue himself. I think he was in on it. At some level, he was in on it. And so it was just that Mr. Deputy and Miss Prosecutor stuff went so far over the line into criminality and stuff that it was difficult to even create a semblance of legality. We weren't giving up. So he knew that this case could come back to haunt him if he played too much of a kangaroo court judge. But he probably had his orders to convict Dennis of something. And so even if the fraud case crumbled. And so Dennis was prosecuted under a civil law that nobody's ever heard of. And the civil law had an addendum like for criminal penalties if there were really egregious violations of the law, like fraud. Like if fraud was proven, then some criminal penalties could apply. Except it was never proven with Dennis. It was never even tried, really, to prove fraud at a trial. And so all they had was he didn't file a form. And the judge then said, well, the fact is Dennis even admitted he didn't file the form, didn't pay $50, and so he violated the law. Now, of course, Dennis was one out of 100,000 people who violated the same law. He's the only one singled out for this treatment, but he said, you violated the law. And so if you didn't file that form, your subjection is 3 years in prison. Because he invoked the criminal part, but fraudulently, because Dennis was never convicted of any ill intent or any of that kind of stuff. Intent to deceive, none of that. And so it was a thing where, yeah, it was totally bogus that the judge did that. So he was really still a kangaroo court judge, but he wasn't as kangaroo court as the previous judges. Yeah, and then anyway, and then he heard, in fact, Mr. Investigator told Mr. Researcher that, the judges decided that, yeah, there was misconduct, but not enough to dismiss the case. That was the scuttlebutt that we got. In fact, it got back to Mr. Chern, back to Bill. And so anyway, so Bill basically wanted more money to keep defending Dennis, and Dennis really didn't have it. And so he was going to move to get off the case. Again, it wasn't going to be this big splash in the career-making case that he was expecting. So Dennis, though, told him, like, don't withdraw from the case. Don't put in your motion to withdraw until after the judge's rule of misconduct. Because you're the only reason that we've gotten this far. So if you all of a sudden resign before the judge's rule, we know how the judge will rule then. So there's some chance he still might dismiss the case if you're still on the case. But Bill, he filed his motion before the judge ruled on the misconduct. So he basically stabbed Dennis in the back. And so anyway, so then at that hearing, the judge said, well, yeah, the justice system isn't perfect, but I don't see enough misconduct to dismiss the case, which was a lie, really. I mean, the stuff that Mr. Researcher testified to, just him alone should have dismissed the case. But they didn't. And well, anyway, so the judge goes, I'm not dismissing the case for misconduct, but my next order of business is your motion to withdraw, Mr. Bill. And anyway, then he said, Bill, when you first stood in front of me, you said that you were Dennis's attorney of choice and that you were going to defend him. Well, guess what, Bill? You're going to defend Dennis. I don't care if you go bankrupt. You're going to defend Dennis. So there you go. So basically, he took Bill hostage. And Dennis knew that if Bill was there under duress, he wasn't going to be a very good attorney for Dennis. And so all of a sudden, Bill was like, really like, Dennis, let's do a deal. So anyway, so they ended up doing a plea bargain. And the plea bargain was, yeah, Dennis didn't file the form. And and again, the judge made him compel him to sign a felony form for not filing a form becomes a felony in Ventura County. Again, it was still kangaroo court. It just wasn't as kangaroo court as it had been before. And so, but Dennis had rights to appeal all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court that not filing a form shouldn't be a felony. Duh, right? So this was Dennis's deal. Well, the courts reneged on the deal all the way. In fact, Bill was desperate. And he just said, Dennis, I'll do your appeal work for free, and it'll take 6 or 7 years to go through the appeal process. This kind of stuff. Well, it didn't. It took 2 years. In 2 years, Dennis was in prison. Kangarooed into it. In fact, Dennis tried to withdraw his plea because the higher courts all reneged on the deal, which was all the higher courts said was that, well, he pled guilty, end of story. Instead of, addressing the question of, is not filing a form a felony? They refused to go there. So again, the courts reneged on their deal. Again, Dennis got hoodwinked into his plea bargain. So then they kangarooed him to prison and tried to get him killed by the inmates, which I will discuss later. So in open court, during the hearings, the judge actually said that he aspired to serve on a higher bench, which I bet was probably either the federal court or the California Supreme Court. And he was in his 50s. He was a young guy in his 50s still. And anyway, but a few months after he worked Dennis into the plea bargain, he suddenly retired at the ripe old age of 59. And my guess is he received some kind of compensation for his performance. I don't know how, but I'm sure he got something for what he did. And another interesting tidbit was, and again, I mentioned before that I grew up, our next door neighbor was, I was growing up, was the secretary for the man who became the district attorney of Ventura County. As I earlier mentioned, the Guerrero political machine there, the guy served for 30 years and like never ran, nobody opposed him. And it was just, again, a well-oiled gangster machine there in Ventura County. And so my father, after this case started, my father started telling me what a gangster he knew the guy was. Well, anyway, so the day Dennis does the plea bargain, and there were a couple sessions there in the courtroom, the district attorney himself came to the courtroom 3 times that day. And the clerk of the court, the woman who was there, the clerk, and that's an official of the court, as during one of those sessions, probably after his 3rd appearance of the district attorney, she took Dennis aside and said, I've never seen the district attorney in a courtroom before. In fact, I've never been very close to the guy before. And he came into the courtroom for your case 3 times today. Who the hell are you? Yeah, this is how unusual, again, everything about Dennis's case set records, etc. This is how unusual it was. So again, palms were greased in Ventura County for what happened. And the attorney and the district attorney himself was in on it. They all were. So, and Bill's federal lawsuit was dismissed. In fact, the ruling is informative. So basically, the federal court said that having criminals as police and prosecutors was fine. Yeah, so they're all protected by prosecutorial immunity and statute of limitations. Yeah, so they said it didn't matter what crimes they committed. Yeah, the federal levels, it doesn't matter. And this is the federal appeals court, which is the kangaroo court that Harry Piggerson, the gangster judge, officiated at. And in fact, Bill was threatened with disbarment if he were filed the case. And so Bill was rudely put into his place. In fact, when I saw Dennis in 2013, he said that Bill was a different man after taking Dennis's case, and not for the better. Bill realized he was nobody. Yeah, he thought taking on the IRS and beating him, et cetera, was a big deal. And they treated him like he was something unpleasant they'd stepped in and were unceremoniously wiping from the soles of their shoes. That's how they treated Bill. Yeah, so Bill was nobody. Of course, now Ms. Prosecutor was supposed to be a judge a few years later. Several years after that, Mr. Deputy retired to a hero's farewell, and his annual pension today is $300,000 a year. And in fact, Ms. Prosecutor was actually voted Trial Judge of the Year in 2017, and then she retired to a hero's farewell. In fact, she's on the board of that one building law school as one of the most illustrious graduates. The lives of the high and mighty. Now Zoom crashed. Yeah, so life in high-tech world. So Zoom crashed, Microsoft crashed, Zoom crashed. So back to where I was with this. So during her judgeship, Ms. Prosecutor, and again, I mentioned Mr. Researcher kept getting called into jury duty. Well, one day he was called into jury duty, and she was the judge. And she actually had a facelift or two. I think he didn't recognize her. He didn't recognize her from the trial several years earlier. But as they're going through the jury list, she recognizes his name, and she looks up and she goes, "Oh, you!" And she called a recess, and she literally called a recess, closed the courtroom, and took Mr. Researcher back to her chambers for an hour to quiz him about Dennis. Yeah, and this is several years later. And anyway, and when I saw Dennis in 2013, I mentioned that incident where she called a recess to take Mr. Researcher back to her chambers and grill him for an hour in a friendly way, but she grilled him for an hour about Dennis. And Alice, Dennis's wife, didn't get it. She was confused about why that would have happened. And Dennis and I had to explain to her that Dennis's case made her career. Yeah, so this is the one when she takes her dying breath, she'll remember that case. And it made her, but it wasn't fun for her either. And we'll never know how deeply all the evil went. So the global elite were definitely involved, and how much they had to do with what happened in Ventura. Again, my guess is that they just greased a few key palms. And the rest, and again, the system's so corrupt, the incentives are so perverse that Mr. Prosecutor, Mr. Deputy, Mr. Psychic, all Mr. Investigator, they lie, cheat, and steal to get their coveted convictions and stuff because that's how they were evaluated in their careers, you know, and then promotions were dangled. So everybody got promoted. Yeah, everybody got promoted, all this kind of stuff. So it was just and dirty, but it's gangster stuff. And so they were dirtier than normal. Yeah, Mr. Deputy was a psychopath. He was a psychopath like Bill, the VPA hitman, Bill Delp. Yeah, another psychopath. And again, when he unmasked himself to me when I was on the witness stand, was the turning point in my life. I said he showed me the meaning of evil. So that was educational for me. I should be grateful. So anyway, so that was sort of the end of the case then. And so Dennis, again, I'll get to it later, how they kangarooed him into prison and tried to get him killed in prison, which Dennis miraculously survived. I'll get to that in a future post. But anyway, so this ends that. And my next post is going to be me and my life that year in 1990 and my exit from Ventura, which I have not returned to. I don't plan to return. So anyway, that's all for now. Thank you.